For centuries, the story of the transatlantic slave trade has been told as a tale of European ships arriving on African shores, dragging innocent people into chains and carrying them away into the darkness. And while it is true that Europeans built the ships, forged the chains, and created the markets of misery across the Atlantic, this is not the full story. The darker truth, the truth many were never told, is that Africa was not just a victim of slavery, it was also a participant. Powerful kings, wealthy chiefs, and entire kingdoms sold their own brothers and sisters into bondage. Neighbor betrayed neighbor, tribes turned against tribes. And in their quest for guns, gold, and power, African rulers helped fuel the very system that destroyed millions of lives. This is the forgotten story of the tribes and kingdoms that sold their own people into slavery, a story of betrayal, greed, and a darkness that Africa has never fully escaped. This is Voices of the Forgotten, where Africa's buried truths rise again. The roots of African involvement in the slave trade stretch back further than many realize. Long before the Europeans arrived, Africans practiced forms of slavery within their societies. Captives from wars were often enslaved. Criminals, debtors, and even the poor could be forced into servitude. These systems were harsh, but they were not the same as the transatlantic trade that would later devastate the continent. When the Portuguese first sailed to West Africa in the 1400s, they found kings and chiefs who were already familiar with slavery. The Portuguese brought new demand. Thousands upon thousands of human beings needed for plantations in the Americas. The African rulers saw opportunity. They could exchange captives for guns, cloth, alcohol, and wealth. The door was opened, and from that moment, betrayal became business. One of the most infamous examples was the Kingdom of Dahomey in what is today Benin. Founded in the early 1600s, Dahomey rose to power not by building alliances, but by raiding its neighbors and selling captives. The kingdom became feared for its ruthless military, including the legendary Dahomey Amazons, an all-female regiment of warriors who showed no mercy. Entire villages were burned. Men, women, and children were dragged away in ropes and chains. By the 18th century, Dahomey was exporting more than 10,000 slaves each year through the port of Ouidah. European merchants, Portuguese, French, and later the British, lined the coast, waiting with muskets, rum, and gold. In Ouidah, slaves were forced through what is now remembered as the Door of No Return, a final walk through stone gates to the ships that would take them across the Atlantic. Families were torn apart. Children cried for parents they would never see again. Yet to the kings of Dahomey, this was wealth and power. One European observer in the 1700s wrote, "The king of Dahomey looks upon men as a harvest that grows every year."
The Ashanti Empire. To the west, in present-day Ghana, another powerful kingdom rose to prominence, the Ashanti Empire. Founded in 1701, the Ashanti quickly became one of the richest and most feared empires in West Africa. Their capital, Kumasi, was a city of wealth and splendor, its royal palace decorated with gold. But much of this wealth came from the slave trade. The Ashanti waged constant wars against neighboring tribes, capturing prisoners not just for political control, but to sell them to European traders. By the mid-1700s, the Ashanti were trading thousands of captives every year in exchange for European guns. These guns, in turn, allowed them to fight more wars, capture more slaves, and grow even stronger. One chilling account from a British trader in 1817 described Kumasi's slave markets, where captives were bound, branded, and sold like cattle. The Ashanti saw slavery as both a weapon and a business. And like Dahomey, they did not hesitate to sell Africans to the highest bidder, even if those Africans spoke the same language or shared the same ancestors. The Yoruba states. Further east, in what is today Nigeria, the Yoruba kingdoms were torn apart by civil wars. The most powerful of these was the Oyo Empire, which, at its height, stretched across a vast territory. The Oyo, like their neighbors, turned war into profit. Prisoners of war were sold to Portuguese and British traders along the coast. Chiefs and nobles enriched themselves by selling captives, while villages lived in fear of raids. But it was not only enemies who were sold. In Yoruba lands, debt slavery became common. Families who could not pay debts were forced to sell children or relatives to settle what they owed. A father might watch helplessly as his son was led away in chains. By the late 1700s, Yoruba land had become one of the largest sources of slaves for the Atlantic trade. In some regions, betrayal ran so deep that people avoided traveling at night for fear of being kidnapped and sold.
The Kingdom of Kongo. The betrayal was not limited to West Africa. In Central Africa, the Kingdom of Kongo, once a proud and powerful Christian kingdom, became consumed by the slave trade. When the Portuguese first made contact in the late 1400s, King Nzinga Mbemba, also known as Alfonso I, welcomed Christianity and European trade. But as Portuguese demand for slaves grew, the kingdom descended into chaos. Kongo nobles began kidnapping villagers to sell. Rival factions fought bloody wars, with captives sold as slaves. Alfonso himself once wrote desperate letters to the King of Portugal, begging for the trade to stop, warning that his kingdom was being destroyed from within. But the Portuguese ignored him, and Kongo continued to bleed its people into slavery. By the 1600s, the once mighty kingdom had fractured, its rulers corrupted by greed and betrayal. Hi, thank you for watching up to this point. If you love African mystery history, comment the country you are watching from so we can appreciate you. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you'll be the first to see our next story. Now, let's continue. The Igbo betrayals. Among the Igbo people of southeastern Nigeria, betrayal also ran deep. While the Igbo were often victims of raids by outsiders, some Igbo chiefs and middlemen became active participants in the trade. Captives were often kidnapped during festivals, ambushed during market days, or betrayed by their own neighbors. European traders recorded how Igbo chiefs grew wealthy, selling their own kinsmen for European goods. One British account from the 18th century described how children were lured with promises of food or gifts, only to be seized and sold into slavery. Families were torn apart, not by foreign invaders, but by their own countrymen. The Swahili Coast. On the other side of the continent, along the Swahili coast of East Africa, the betrayal took a different form. Here, African rulers worked with Arab traders to sell millions of East Africans into slavery. In Zanzibar, one of the largest slave markets in the world, Africans were sold to buyers from Arabia, Persia, and India. The trade here lasted well into the 19th century, long after the Atlantic trade had begun to decline. European explorers who visited the Zanzibar markets described the scenes as hell on earth. Men, women, and children were lined up in chains, examined like animals, and sold to the highest bidder. And behind it all were African rulers and merchants who profited from every sale. In the end, the betrayal did not bring lasting power. The same guns and wealth that African kings received in exchange for slaves were used against them. The Ashanti Empire, once rich and feared, was eventually defeated by the British. Dahomey collapsed under French conquest. The Oyo Empire fell into ruin. The Kingdom of Kongo, broken by civil wars and corruption, disappeared from history.
The betrayal that once seemed like power had weakened Africa from within. By the time Europeans moved from trading partners to conquerors in the 19th century, many African kingdoms were too fractured and weakened to resist. The transatlantic slave trade lasted more than 400 years and took over 12 million Africans across the ocean. Millions more died in raids, marches, and holding cells before they ever saw a ship. Europeans and Arabs built the markets, but without African kings and tribes supplying the captives, the trade could never have reached such devastating scale. This is the darkest truth, that Africa's greatest chains were not made of iron, but of betrayal. Neighbor sold neighbor, brother sold brother, and the continent has never fully healed from those scars. The story of slavery is not just one of foreign invaders. It is also a story of how greed and power led Africans to sell their own people, and in the process, sell away their future. This is Voices of the Forgotten. And that is the truth history tried to forget.